I never thought I'd become the kind of man who checks security footage before he even unpacks his bag. Before last year, I trusted people. I trusted systems. I trusted the simple idea that a locked door meant something. I know better now. My name is Ray Kowalski. I'm 47, divorced for 5 years, and I work as a drilling engineer on an offshore platform in the Gulf of Mexico. 21 days on, 7 days off. That's my rotation, has been for the last 11 years. I own a 4-bedroom house in Katy, Texas, a suburb west of Houston, in a neighborhood called Cypress Creek Estates. Nice area, good HOA, quiet streets. I bought it during the marriage, thinking we'd fill those bedrooms eventually. My ex-wife took the kids to her parents' place in Austin after the divorce. The bedrooms stayed empty. I kept the house because it was paid off and because somewhere in the back of my mind I still thought of it as home base, even if home base only saw me 7 days a month. That's the vulnerability I never thought about. 21 days away, every single month, like clockwork. Same schedule, filed with my employer, predictable as sunrise. I told my neighbors when I was leaving. I told the HOA management company. I told the landscaping service. I told the HVAC contractor who came for seasonal maintenance. I told everyone, because being neighborly felt like the right thing to do. I should have kept my mouth shut. It started with a voicemail I almost didn't check. I was on the platform, 3 days into my rotation, when I saw a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. Texas area code, though. I played the message during my lunch break, sitting in the cafeteria with the hum of industrial equipment vibrating through the floor. Mr. Kowalski, this is Margaret Thorne. I'm the president of the Cypress Creek Estates HOA. I'm calling because we've received some complaints from your neighbors regarding your property, and I'd really like to talk to you before we have to file anything formal. Please give me a call when you get a chance. I almost called her back that same afternoon, and didn't only because a pressure issue came up on the rig that ate my evening. The next morning I reached her at 8. Mr. Kowalski, thank you for calling back. I'll be direct with you. Last Friday night, there were approximately 30 to 40 cars parked on and around your street, many of them blocking driveways. Multiple residents reported loud music from your property until well past 2 in the morning. Your next-door neighbor Frank said people were using the common green space behind your property as overflow parking. I set down my coffee cup. I was on a platform in the Gulf of Mexico last Friday night. There was a brief pause. I'm sorry? I wasn't home. I'm offshore right now. I won't be back for another 18 days. Another pause, longer this time. Mr. Kowalski, are you saying you don't know about the event that was held at your property? I'm saying I was not there. I did not authorize any event. I have not given anyone permission to be in my house. Her voice shifted. That particular shift people make when a simple complaint call turns into something else entirely. Then I think you need to know that Frank also mentioned this wasn't the first time. He said he's been seeing cars there on weekend nights for at least the past 2 months. He assumed you'd started renting it out for parties or something. He didn't want to make trouble. My hands were steady, but the rest of me wasn't. Can you tell Frank to take photos if he sees anything? And please don't contact whoever is doing this. Don't let them know anyone's noticed. Of course. But Mr. Kowalski, should you call the police? I told her I would look into it, and hung up. I didn't call the police that day, and I want to explain why, because it's the question I've been asked more than any other. The answer is that I'd been through a lease dispute 2 years earlier with a contractor. I'd made the mistake of letting stay in the house while I was offshore, and that situation had nearly turned into a legal nightmare. My attorney at the time had walked me through something I hadn't understood before. In Texas, if someone can claim any kind of occupancy or tenancy in your property, even without a formal agreement, forcing them out without documentation becomes a civil matter that can take months. She had told me, if this ever happens again, you collect everything first. Dates, times, photos, footage. You give the police something they can act on immediately rather than something that drags into housing court. That advice was sitting in the back of my head when I hung up with Margaret. I called Frank directly. He picked up on the second ring. Ray, I was hoping you'd call. Tell me what you've seen. He'd seen it the first time 7 weeks ago. A Saturday night in late September. Cars started arriving around 8 in the evening. Mostly newer models, some ride shares dropping people off. Music that he could feel through his walls. It went until about 2:30. He'd seen lights on in every room of the house. He thought maybe I'd rented it to a family member for a party, something like that. The second time was 2 Saturdays later. Then a third. He said he'd counted at least 4 separate events. He hadn't called me because he assumed I knew, and because he didn't want to stick his nose in. Did you ever see who was running it? Like someone who showed up early, let people in? Frank thought about it. There's a guy, young guy, maybe 30, dark hair. He usually shows up in the afternoon before the crowd. He's got a key, lets himself in, props the back gate, and then I don't see him again until after everybody leaves. He drives a silver Ram 1500. I thanked Frank and told him I'd handle it. I spent my next break researching. I typed my home address into every event rental platform I could find. Peerspace, Gigster, Splacer. On my third search, I found it. Katie Craftsman, perfect for upscale private events. Sleeps 8, seats 40 plus. Chef's kitchen, private backyard, gated. Available for corporate events, celebrations, and weekend gatherings. $850 per night. Minimum 4-hour booking. The photos were of my house, my living room with my furniture rearranged, my kitchen, my backyard with string lights I had never purchased strung between my patio posts and the fence. Whoever had taken the photos had actually staged the place, brought in decorative elements to make it look more like a venue. They had professionally photographed it. The listing had 19 reviews. The earliest one was dated 8 weeks ago. Wonderful space for our team retreat. Host Kyle was very accommodating with setup time. Stunning home in a great neighborhood. 5 stars. Host Kyle. There were 19 reviews averaging 4.8 stars. At $850 a night with apparent weekend bookings going back 2 months, this person had made somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 off my house, off my furniture, off my kitchen, off my backyard, while I was drilling wells in the Gulf of Mexico. I set up the cameras from offshore. That part sounds more dramatic than it was. I called my buddy Dave, who lives 4 streets over, and still had a spare key I'd given him for emergencies years ago. I ordered 4 wireless cameras for next-day delivery to his address and walked him through the installation over FaceTime. Dave is retired, former military, and the kind of man who takes a task like this very seriously. He spent 3 hours in my house getting the angles right. 1 camera in the living room behind the entertainment center, 1 in the kitchen, 1 in the entryway with a view of the front door, 1 in the backyard covering the gate and the patio. I had the app running on my phone within 48 hours of Margaret's call. On that Thursday evening, 4 days after I'd talked to Frank, my phone buzzed with a motion alert at 3:47 inches the afternoon. I was in my bunk and I pulled up the feed. A man in his early 30s, dark hair, wearing jeans and a gray Henley, walked through my front door with a key. He moved through the house like he knew it. He didn't hesitate at any doorway. He went to the kitchen first, opened the refrigerator, my refrigerator, stocked with food I hadn't bought, and grabbed a bottle of water. Then he walked into the living room, picked up a remote from a basket on the coffee table that I had never owned, and turned on the television. He sat down on my couch and scrolled through his phone. I recorded every second. Around 5, a woman arrived. She let herself in as well, using a key. She was in her late 20s, red hair, carrying a large tote bag and a portable Bluetooth speaker. She and the man I assumed was Kyle hugged briefly. They started moving furniture. They pushed my dining table against the wall, moved 2 armchairs to create an open floor space, and set up folding tables along the perimeter that they pulled from what I can only assume were bags in the garage. They strung additional lights in the backyard. It looked practiced. It looked like a setup routine they'd done many times. By 8:30, people were arriving. I sat offshore and watched strangers walk through my front door, hug each other, pour drinks in my kitchen, and stand in my backyard laughing under lights they had hung. Someone used my bathroom. Someone went upstairs. The cameras didn't cover the upstairs, but I could see people on the staircase. I recorded for 6 hours that night. When the last guest left around 2, Kyle and the woman did a quick cleanup, wiping down surfaces, taking out bags of trash, returning furniture to roughly where it had been. They were out by 3. The next morning I called Dave and asked him to check if anything was damaged or obviously disturbed. He walked through and reported that the house looked basically fine, but that there were rental tables in my garage he'd never seen before, a portable bar cart in the corner, and about a dozen folding chairs stacked against the wall. Someone had been using my garage as storage for event supplies. Over the following week, I documented 3 more visits. Kyle came alone twice, midweek, and appeared to be doing administrative things, sitting at my kitchen table with a laptop, making calls I couldn't hear clearly. The woman came once on her own and spent about an hour doing what looked like a deep clean, which I found both offensive and perversely thoughtful. On the 8th day of surveillance, I got the breakthrough I needed. Kyle was at my kitchen table again with his laptop when he got a call, and this time he had it on speaker, and his voice carried clearly through the camera mic. "Yeah, it's set for Saturday. Full buyout, private birthday. I've got the deposit already." A pause while he listened. I know. But Morrison's not going to be an issue. He's not back until the 12th. Another pause. Danny says the rotation schedule is locked in. Morrison won't be back until the 12th. We've got 3 more weekends easy. Morrison? I didn't know anyone named Morrison. I searched the name against everyone who had access to my property. My HVAC contractor, my landscaping service, the HOA management company, Granite Ridge Property Services, which had a key to my property for maintenance coordination. I called Granite Ridge and asked to speak with the office manager. I told her I was doing a routine check on who in their organization had access to my property information, specifically my schedule. She was helpful without meaning to be. She told me that tenant and owner schedules were accessible to their full maintenance team so they could coordinate service visits. One name on that team was a man named Daniel Morrison, listed as a general maintenance technician. I had Dave drive by Granite Ridge's parking lot the next morning and send me photos of the vehicles there. One of them was a blue Silverado with a magnetic company logo on the door. I could make out enough of the logo to search it. 2 hours later, I had the full image from their website. Then I went back through my surveillance footage and looked at every visitor Kyle had received. On day 3, in the afternoon, a man in a Granite Ridge uniform had come to the house. He'd stayed for 20 minutes. I had his face clearly on camera. Now I had the full picture. Kyle was the front-facing operator, the one who managed the listing, handled the guests, ran the events. The woman, who I still hadn't identified, handled logistics and probably the marketing. Daniel Morrison, the maintenance tech, was the insider. He had access to homeowner schedules through Granite Ridge and had sold that access to Kyle. He knew exactly when my house would be empty and for how long. On my next day off rotation, I didn't go directly to my house. I went to the Houston Police Department non-emergency office and asked to speak with a detective. I had my tablet with me, 6 days of footage, a folder with screenshots from the listing, including the reviews and the revenue estimates I'd calculated, documentation of Daniel Morrison's employment at Granite Ridge, and the audio recording of Kyle's phone call confirming he had advanced knowledge of my schedule. The detective was a compact man in his 50s named Garza, and he listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me a few questions, looked through the footage, and then leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Kowalski, you have done a better job building a case than most civilians I've seen. This is trespass, theft of services, and fraud. The schedule information from the maintenance employee potentially adds a conspiracy charge." He glanced through the listing screenshots again. "What platform was this on?" I told him, "They're going to want to know too. They've been processing payments for events at a property the host doesn't own. You'll want to contact their trust and safety team after we file. Can you arrest them before the next event?" Garza looked at his calendar. "When's the next booking?" "This Saturday. Full buyout. Birthday party. Deposits already paid." He nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure we're ready by Friday. I won't pretend the next 4 days were easy." I was back on rotation, and every hour felt like waiting for something to break wrong. I kept checking the camera feeds. Kyle came by Wednesday to prep. He brought in additional lighting, a portable cooler, and what looked like a professional-grade speaker setup that he clearly expected to retrieve after the event. He treated my house like a warehouse, like a storage unit he was renting by the month. Saturday arrived. I had flown back to Houston on a personal day I'd arranged. I was parked 2 blocks from my house at 7 in the evening when Garza texted me. "In position. We'll move after we confirm both principals are on site." At 7:53, Kyle arrived in the silver Ram. At 8:14, the woman arrived in a white Hyundai. At 8:40, the first guests started pulling up. I sat in my rental car watching the street. Frank texted me from his driveway. "They're here. Lots of cars." At 10:22, my phone buzzed. "Garza, moving now." I drove to my street and parked. I walked up to my own house for the first time in 3 weeks and stood on the sidewalk while 2 patrol cars pulled up. I could hear music from inside, the low thud of a bass line through my own walls. Someone had rented a fog machine because I could see faint wisps of it through the gaps around the front door. When the officers knocked, it took about 30 seconds for Kyle to answer. He opened the door to the sight of uniformed officers, a detective, and me standing at the end of his rented crowd. The music was still playing inside. 30-some people had no idea what was happening. The expression on Kyle's face when he saw me is something I won't forget. He didn't know what I looked like. He'd rented my house for months, and he didn't know my face. He looked past the officers at me with a kind of blank confusion, and then Garza said, "Are you Kyle Tanner?" And something in Kyle's expression shifted into something much more specific than confusion. The woman, whose name I learned was Danielle, was in the kitchen when officers entered through the back. She had the presence of mind to close her laptop before they got to her. It didn't matter. Everything was already documented. The guests were asked to leave. A few of them were angry. One woman celebrating her birthday loudly complained to anyone who would listen that she'd paid good money for this venue. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She had paid good money. She just hadn't paid me. Daniel Morrison was picked up at his apartment the following morning. The full investigation took 6 weeks. What it uncovered was larger than I'd expected. Kyle and Danielle had been running this operation for nearly 14 months. They had targeted 11 properties in total across the Houston metro area, all of them owned by people who worked extended rotation jobs offshore or traveled heavily for work or owned second properties they visited infrequently. Daniel wasn't the only inside source. He had a counterpart at a different property management company in the Woodlands who had been feeding him schedules and access information for 4 additional properties. Between them, they had run over 200 paid events. Total revenue documented by investigators was just under $190,000. I testified in the fall. The prosecutor built the case around the surveillance footage I'd collected, the audio recording, and the financial documentation from the rental platform. Kyle's attorney argued that since no guests knew the rentals were unauthorized, the harm was limited. The judge was not persuaded. Kyle Tanner received 3 years in state prison and was ordered to pay restitution. Danielle received 18 months, suspended to probation with restitution, because she cooperated fully and provided the financial records the prosecution needed to establish the full scope of the scheme. Daniel Morrison was convicted of breach of fiduciary duty and conspiracy and received a 2-year sentence. His counterpart in the Woodlands received the same. My share of the restitution was $22,000, which covered the unauthorized use of the property, the utilities, some minor damage I found after the fact, scuff marks on hardwood floors, a crack in a tile in the kitchen that I suspect came from someone dropping something heavy during setup and legal fees. It didn't cover the 3 weeks I spent anxious and distracted while on a job where distraction can get people killed. It didn't cover the way I felt walking back through my own house that Saturday night, after everyone left, picking up cups strangers had set down on my coffee table, finding a jacket someone had left draped over my dining chair, seeing my furniture in positions I hadn't placed it in. Granite Ridge Property Services terminated Daniel Morrison immediately upon his arrest and launched an internal audit. 4 other employees with access to owner schedule information were quietly let go in the months that followed. I don't know if those terminations were connected to the investigation or not. I moved my property management to a different company, one that uses a tiered access system where maintenance technicians can schedule visits without seeing owner personal information, including travel schedules. I had every lock in the house rekeyed. I installed a smart lock system with temporary codes that I generate and expire manually. The cameras stayed. I added 2 more. Several of the other property owners reached out to me after the case concluded. We'd all been victimized by the same network. All of us, people who worked demanding jobs that required extended absence, all of us living in the gap between trusting the systems we'd hired and having the bandwidth to verify them. One man, a commercial airline pilot, told me that guests had gone through his home office and that someone had found his spare credit card in a desk drawer. He spent 4 months dealing with fraudulent charges after the fact. Another man, a surgeon who owned a vacation property, said he'd discovered that several pieces of art he'd believed were being stored safely had been moved or were simply gone, replaced with knockoffs, close enough that he hadn't noticed until he looked closely. He was still in the middle of an insurance claim when he called me. What happened to me was a violation, but for some of the others, it was that and more. I still work the same rotation. 21 days out, 7 days back. The math of my life hasn't changed, but the way I manage my absence has changed completely, and I want to be specific about what that looks like, because I wish someone had laid it out for me before any of this happened. I do not share my schedule with property management or service companies in the form of extended travel windows anymore. Instead, I give them specific appointment windows when they have reason to be in the house, generated on demand. No one needs to know I'll be gone for the next 3 weeks. They need to know that a technician can access the property between 2 and 4 on a specific Tuesday. I installed cameras before I needed them, not after. I have cameras covering every entry point and the main common areas. I check them every time I return to shore, not because I expect a problem, but because the habit of checking is the protection. The few minutes it takes to review a week of motion alerts costs me nothing, and has already flagged one situation, a landscaping crew member who entered the house through an unlocked back door, probably innocently, but still without any authorization. I handled that with a direct conversation and a lock check. Problem solved before it became one. I have Frank's number, and I text him every time I leave, not to ask him to watch the house, but to tell him plainly, I'm offshore until the 17th. If you see anything unusual at my place, call me directly first, then call the police. Frank is happy to be that person. He just needed to be asked specifically. I searched my address on every event and rental platform I could find. I set a Google alert for my address. This sounds excessive until you understand that the listing for my property had been live for 8 weeks before I found it, had 19 positive reviews, and I had no idea it existed. I also learned to read the early signals that I ignored. My utility bill had been running about $40 higher per month than my historical average. I noticed it, thought it was seasonal fluctuation, and moved on. $40 a month isn't nothing, but it isn't dramatic enough to stop you. When I looked at the bills after the fact, the pattern was consistent and clear. Someone running events at my house, using my HVAC to climate control a crowd of 40 people multiple times a month, showed up plainly in the data. I just wasn't looking at the data carefully. My neighbor's observations were also a flag I didn't have access to because I'd never explicitly told Frank what normal looked like at my house when I was gone. He assumed the cars were my guests. If I'd told him once, clearly, that no one should be using my property in my absence, he would have called me the first Saturday. 7 weeks of events might have been one. I drive past my house sometimes when I'm heading out for my rotation, and I think about the fact that Kyle Tanner sat on my couch, used my kitchen, let strangers into my space for 14 months, and thought of me as nothing more than a reliably empty asset. I was a scheduling problem he'd already solved. He knew my rotation as well as I did because Daniel had given it to him. He'd built a business around my predictability. The thing that took me the longest to process wasn't the financial loss, or even the legal process. It was that someone had made a calculated decision that my home, the place I paid for, that I returned to, that I thought of as mine, in the most basic sense, was available for repurposing when I wasn't looking. That my absence was a resource. That the trust I extended to companies I hired to maintain my property was a backdoor, and someone had found it and walked right through. I'm more careful now. Not paranoid, but deliberate. There's a difference. Paranoid means you assume the worst, without evidence. Deliberate means you build the habit of verification into your routine so that evidence exists if you ever need it. The cameras are running right now. I'm offshore. My street in Katy is quiet. Frank has my number. The smart lock log shows no entries since I left Tuesday morning. That's what safety looks like now, for me. Not the assumption of a locked door, the confirmation of one. If you own property and you travel for work, whether it's a week, a month, or 3, the question isn't whether someone would be bold enough to do what Kyle Tanner did. The answer to that question is already in front of you. The question is whether they'd find your house easy enough to make it worth their time. Make it harder. Document your baseline. Know your neighbors well enough to have their number. And if something feels off a bill that's a little high, a neighbor who mentions something in passing, a voicemail you almost didn't check, treat it as a signal before it becomes a story. I almost let that voicemail go to spam. Margaret Thorne called from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't call back. I'm glad I did.